Greece is deep in debt, nearly a quarter of its population unemployed, its banks running out of money, all signs of an economy spinning out of control. A Greek exit from the Eurozone, a growing possibility, threatens, in the short term at least, to make the situation worse. What went wrong? After adopting the euro in 2001, Greece's competitiveness fell further behind many of its Eurozone peers. Germany and other countries had stronger and more export-oriented business sectors. Greece struggled to earn enough euros from abroad to pay for its imports. At the same time, the Greek government was able to borrow money cheaply because, as a Eurozone member, banks and other investors thought a Greek treasury bond was as safe as one, say, issued by Germany. Athens used the money it borrowed to pay for a rapid increase in spending on pensions and other social benefits, and to cover its persistent failure to collect taxes owed. It also splurged on the 2004 Olympic Games. Greece's debt had long been growing faster than its overall economy, a problem made far worse when the global economic crisis struck, dragging Greece into a recession. On top of that, a newly elected government discovered in late 2009 that Greece had been cooking the books, understating its budget problems. Spooked by that and the growing size of Greece's debt and deficit, investors started demanding more and more interest to lend money to Greece, effectively cutting off lending. What could Greece do about this? Its options at this point were limited. Since it was part of the Eurozone, it couldn't simply print more money to pay its debts. Only the European Central Bank could print more euros. Unable to refinance its debt, Greece needed a bailout. Its new creditors, including the IMF and the European Union, demanded austerity. That meant raising taxes, cutting pensions, shedding public sector workers, and slashing almost all other kinds of government spending. None of these moves were popular. In 2010, Greece had 835,000 government workers. 2 years later, it had reduced that number by 15%. The heavy spending cuts and tax hikes sucked demand out of Greece's economy and contributed to skyrocketing unemployment. Greece's economy nosedived. Its debt, by 2014, was more than 175% of that year's total economic output. What do Greece's creditors demand now? They demand that Greece continue making more economic overhauls, including pension cuts and tax increases, as well as loosening up labor rules in exchange for more bailout funds. Nearly 2/3 of Greek voters in a national referendum rejected these terms. What happens next? Greece has only days to present tough economic overhauls that convince its creditors to unlock bailout financing. Otherwise, Greece faces a default on its debts and the likely collapse of its banking system. What would that mean? It would likely mean Greece returns to the drachma, but the value of the drachma would likely plummet immediately, drastically reducing the value of people's savings and incomes. Vital imports could become expensive and potentially scarce. Greece would still not be able to borrow money from capital markets, so the government would need to fire up the printing press and print the money it needs to pay its bills. That might lead to high inflation. The heavy economic disruption could push even more Greek businesses into bankruptcy. On the other hand, if Greece were to leave the Eurozone, it might eventually reduce Greece's dependence on its European creditors, who would take a loss on most of their loans to Greece. The country would likely sink deeper into a depression, but its voters there seem to be saying, at least then their country would control more of the means to dig itself out. Eventually. That's the short answer.